So here we are. It is 2018, and this is the very first, I like to call it the first official Sonic Storytellers podcast. I'm joined here with Matt Kenyon from mattkenyon.net. Say hi, Matt.
Howdy.
And this is technically our 8th episode, but the last 7 have kind of been piecemealed together from previous chats and some different things. But we're really excited about today's chat. Hopefully keep it a little bit shorter, maybe under the 30-minute threshold or so. But I think it's an important topic to talk about, and it's this idea of how to deal with creative burnout. And this is something that as composers, I think we deal with a lot because as artists, as creatives, this is something that we sometimes don't know how to manage our energy levels and our time. And we can find ourselves getting completely burnt out and unfocused and unproductive. And what really spawned this chat in particular, about a couple weeks ago, one of my close composer friends was actually going through this exact thing. And he was just devastated because he had just worked on this really big project, which is typically the case. And he put all of his heart, soul, energy into it. And it was one of those really short game jam type competitions. So he had a few days to write a tremendous amount of music. And the end result was really impressive. But afterwards, he was just like, what do I do now?
Right.
How do I move forward with my life? I don't really have anything left to give. How am I supposed to get back into a regular process of this? So Matt, what I want to talk about today are 3 kind of core questions to kind of what is creative burnout, maybe how it affects composers differently than other artists. Number 2 would be, what are your top recommendations for preventing creative burnout? And then what advice we might have for any composers seeking to get out of this creative burnout that they're in right now. So I'm excited to jump into this thing.
Absolutely.
And do you have any, I guess, opening thoughts before we jump in?
Sure. Well, I just want to say thanks so much for having me on. This is a ton of fun. This is the first time I've ever been a podcast guest. I love talking about this stuff and thinking about this stuff. There's one thing I want to say for your composer friend that I was thinking of while you were speaking that may be helpful to him and maybe to some of our listeners as well. Adam Neely is a YouTuber and music educator on YouTube. He graduated from Berklee, and he has this phenomenal video about his Berklee senior recital and how he got really depressed afterwards. And I think that could probably speak to a lot of what you just said. So I think we should put that video in the show notes. So that's just one little thing I want to add in there because he really goes deep into the sort of post-project blues that a lot of artists have. So I think that would be a great resource to check out. And yeah, other than that, I'm ready to jump in as well. I think this is a big topic, and learning how we can manage our creative energy is huge. So yeah, I'm super excited.
Cool. Well, let's jump right in. So the idea here is, what is creative burnout? I talked a little bit about it. I felt kind of this idea of exhaustion, but if you were to maybe define that, what would you say as an observer and as a composer yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great question. I think it's super important that we define our terms whenever we talk about things like this, because we could be talking about 2 different things. So it's always good to make sure that we're on the same page when we're talking about things. So creative burnout to me can mean 2 different things, two kind of disparate ideas. The first is when you just simply do not have the mental or emotional strength to work on a creative project, or in other words, depleted willpower. So it's that feeling in the pit of your stomach that we all experience with our art when it becomes really hard work and we'd literally rather do anything else than work on our creative projects. So that's a tough rut to be in. So that's one aspect of creative burnout. The second, which is maybe akin to what your friend was going through, the second is something, it's very different. The passion is there, the energy is there, but nothing nothing satisfactory is just flowing out of you. There are no ideas. So this is something more like writer's block. So no ideas are coming out of your head, and the ideas that are coming out, you're just not happy with, no matter how hard you try. And that can be very discouraging. That can be very discouraging, and that could almost make you want to quit. The extreme case of creative burnout is very dangerous, because if you let this go unchecked for too long, that's when you start to question whether you even want to do your art anymore, right? So when we think of people that burn out in certain professions, we think of people like, the first thing that comes to my mind is American Beauty with Kevin Spacey. I don't know if anyone in our audience has seen that movie, but basically he throughout the movie, he has this midlife crisis, totally burns out, quits his lucrative advertising job, pretty much goes insane, starts smoking pot, and gets a job at McDonald's at the drive-thru, and just because he's so burnt out on his job. So that's kind of an extreme case, but I think as creatives, when we let this burnout go too far unchecked, whether it's the writer's block burnout or whether it's we just don't have the energy burnout, it could kind of turn into this sort of existential crisis of, man, do I even want to do this anymore? And that can be kind of scary, because I think we all love our art. And if we are in our rational minds, we know that we don't just want to give up. But if it goes unchecked for too long, and we'll talk about more strategies on this podcast about how to make sure it doesn't go unchecked for too long. But if it does, I think it can even cause some of us to quit.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And just as a disclaimer, Matt and I have actually not discussed our answers to these questions yet, and that's half the fun of being here now.
Absolutely.
I actually have slightly different opinions about that, but I want to kind of finish the question, though. How do you think that this might particularly affect composers differently than other types of artists?
Sure. So composers, well, there's a few different things. One is if the composer themselves is if this is a profession. Okay, so that's why I think if you're an artist, we also have to define, are you a professional artist or are you sort of a hobby artist? So for me, it's sort of a good thing, bad thing situation, because right now I don't make money from my compositions. It's completely a hobby. So my creative burnout is going to look different than you, Steven. You are a professional composer. This is how you make your living. So it's a little bit different. And I would almost say that for a composer like me, it can be more dangerous. And here's what I mean. A composer like you, this is your job. You have to compose, right? So you have to sit down and you have to do it. You don't have a choice, or you don't eat. For me, I could distract myself. I could, download a game on Steam, blow a bunch of hours on Broforce, which is awesome, by the way. Awesome game. I could really just ignore the art itself because it's just a hobby for me. I'm a hobbyist. So this is a little different than the question you asked, but I think that the differentiation between professional and personal can make it very different. And I almost think that if you're a professional, you may be in a slightly better position just for the reason that you have to do it. And eventually those gears are going to start turning again when you're just sitting down at your piano, sitting down in your DAW, and you're working day after day after day. In my experience, that's when a lot of the inspiration can come back. So, how this can affect composers specifically different than other artists. Well, I think the distinction between composers and other artists is naturally that we are working with auditory mediums. We're working with non-visual mediums. And so there is a sense in which, and we can probably get to this later in the podcast about ways of preventing creative burnout. I think for composers, we're in a really good position to because our art is ubiquitous. Like music is everywhere. It's one of the most ubiquitous art forms, and so there are lots of sources of inspiration for composers everywhere. You can draw inspiration from music. Like one of the suggestions I have for preventing creative burnout is going through a season of just consuming music rather than creating music. And so I think because music is such a ubiquitous art form, there are so many sources of inspiration that we can go to fill up our inspiration tanks, more so than, say, if you were a classic acrylic painter. That might be kind of difficult, right? Because you have to go to a museum, or you have to somehow access pieces of art that inspire you and that sort of thing. And there's a little more maintenance there. But if you have Spotify, you know what I mean? You can access music that can fill you up and inspire you. And so I think as composers, creative block, we have more opportunities to fix it, if that makes sense. So I think that's one of the distinctions between us and normal artists.
I think that's great. Thank you for that. And I think my response is pretty similar. I will say, though, that kind of in the definition side of creative burnout, I agree in the sense that it's any time that a creative is pushing themselves to that point of exhaustion. You hinted at writer's block almost as if it's, I guess you were saying if you have the passion, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that the writer's block would be if you have the passion, but you're kind of, I guess, stunned not to do it.
So what I would more say, you have the passion, and you have the energy, you have the willpower. But this is something that I've particularly gone through, where, if I can be frank, everything you write is crap. I mean, to yourself for a season. So you sit down and you start plunking away at the piano, and you start playing on guitar, and just nothing that comes out of you is just like, this is not good. I don't like this. This doesn't work. This sounds amateurish. And then you can almost start to feel this doubt, right, in the back of your head of, man, am I even good enough to do this? Like, and you know, we've talked about when we got together last time, about imposter syndrome, and I struggle with that a lot. Where I'll have a season where maybe the stuff I'm writing is not that good, and I just I can't help but start to doubt my own abilities. You know, can I even make it in this industry? Can I make this? So I think that's. It's sort of a sneakier, more subtle form of creative burnout, but that's one thing that could possibly manifest itself as creative burnout.
Okay. So something that I think is kind of at the core of creative burnout is this idea that I think creativity is like a muscle. It is something that it can shrink if it's unused, and it can be injured if it's overused. So I think finding a healthy balance is really the key to having a healthy creative life. And so often I see, such as my friend who, in his case, he overused it. He had this game jam where they stay up for who knows how long, 3 days in a row, and they just work. Gosh. It's like a 72-hour just blast where you sit down and just write music, and you write an entire soundtrack, and the end result's pretty amazing. But of course, you know, you're gonna get sick, and you're gonna just have a miserable week after that. And of course, you're gonna, if in his case he's a professional composer, he's someone who writes other projects too. As soon as you return to your kind of everyday life, if you didn't kind of set that energy aside, and you didn't ramp back up, kind of like working out, you kind of have these warm up moments, these cool down moments, these periods of rest. Without that balance, man, you can just really wreck yourself.
Well, that's encouraging that you say that. And I love your analogy, man, about creativity being a muscle. And I couldn't agree more. And that's interesting because my number one answer in top recommendations for preventing creative burnout is to keep life in balance. So you said that word a lot. And so when we move on to that segment, I would love to touch more on that, because that is something, man, that I think creatives can struggle with. We get super passionate about a project, like you said, like the game jam or whatever it may be. And I know for me personally, I can neglect a lot of important things. So I'll save that for when we get there. But
well, let's just jump into that section. I think we're there on time.
Perfect.
So question number 2, what are your top recommendations for preventing creative burnout? Now, I guess I'll start on that one. Basically, let's go with this muscle analogy. If creative burnout is a result of overusing and straining creativity, then the best way to prevent it is to have breaks and to change your focus and to have these intervals. So, for example, we've talked about this as well, about this idea of deep work, that to really have meaningful, needle moving, profound, impacting work in your life, you gotta basically set aside at least about 3 hours, fans, so that when you sit down, your attention is 100% focused on your craft. It's working on this project. And I think if at all possible, you should try to achieve this at least once a day. But I think if you're going to achieve this multiple times in a day, which some days you can, if you have an entire day to write, whatever, then I think you need to break it up. They can't be side by side. They can't be 3 hours. Oh, let me take a 10-minute break, 3 more hours. You're just going to wear yourself out. It's like, seriously, imagine this. Look at Olympic athletes. Like they'll work out for 3 hours, but they're not going to take 5-minute break and go right back to it. They're going to space out their entire day, and they're going to change up activities. They're going to do something different. So as a composer, one of the cool things is we wear so many hats. Very seldom are you just writing music. In fact, if you look at the life of Howard Shore, for example, the Lord of the Rings composer, he spends the entire morning portion of his day writing, and then he'll spend another 3-hour session maybe mixing, and then he'll do another 3 hours of sheet music, of notation. Wow. And he'll spread out his day. Yeah, he'll work 9 to 12 hours, but they're very different activities. And what's so cool about that is they're all focused, needle moving work. It's all that deep work, but it's all different activities that use different parts of the brain. Some, if you're doing notation, that's analytical. If you're doing composition, actually like on a keyboard or on a DAW, that's using your ear, that's using your tactile, it's using your hands, right? So I think if you can just develop these systems that are all about moving around and doing different things, that's big. And even if one of my favorite examples is Beethoven, he's one of my favorite composers of all time. He used to go on long walks. If he was playing piano and he was really trying to figure out that one chord or that one thing, writer's block essentially, because he was straining that muscle, he would just go on an hour or two walk, and he would just go walk around the park, walk on the street, and he would start whistling the tune. It would just kind of naturally come to him, because now he was physical motion. He was getting away from his environment, allowing himself to really just start to think beyond his head, and allow kind of that third person kind of thinking to come in.
Sure.
And I think that's huge. And physical movement is a really big stress reliever, and it's a way that you can get your body to move. So in my life, if I have a full day to write, I try to break things into definitely for me, I'm a morning person, so I'd love to have like a good 3-hour chunk in the morning. And then I'll have a good lunch period where I can relax and maybe do some smaller admin type tasks. Because usually most people are this way. By about 2 or 3 p.m., we're kind of burnt out, and we're like, let's just call it quits. But
coffee wears out.
Yeah, exactly. So that's when I start to do more of the admin and emails and communications and organization and the things that are not as fun.
Sure.
And that way, maybe I'll read a book or something, just anything that's still productive, but it's going to completely change my energy level. So as much as you can know yourself, be self-aware about where your energy levels live, you can really base that around. So what about you, man? What are some of your recommendations for preventing creative burnout?
Well, this is all awesome stuff, man. I was taking notes while you were speaking. That's just really great. I love the idea of what you said, the third person thinking, because we can get so in our own heads, and I think it can prevent us from really thinking creatively. There's a few things. The first thing, like I mentioned, is keeping life in balance, and you touched a lot about that. We as humans, I've heard it said that we are designed to surge and rest. I mean, that's the pattern, the natural pattern of our lives. Why do we have to sleep 8 hours a night? Because that's just how we are designed. That's how our bodies work. It's how our minds work. We need rest. And so I think when we don't keep life in balance. And what balance means is different for everyone. I mean, a lot of us have families, spouses, significant others. A lot of us, obviously we all have bodies that we need to take care of. We need to eat, we need to drink water, we need to sleep, we need social interaction with people so we don't go insane. We need friends. All these things are things that are healthy. And so, I think for me, I know that when my life is not in balance, even if that means if I am producing a record or mixing and mastering something, there was a time where I mixed and mastered and produced my own record of rearranged hymns, and there was a time where I was racing to the finish line to get it done, and I was neglecting all sorts of stuff. I was neglecting any sort of intellectual, emotional, spiritual, relational responsibilities, and man, I was making sloppy mistakes. And that's the ironic thing, is that I was devoting all my time to my craft, and I was not keeping my life in balance, and it was causing me to make mistakes. So I think keeping your life in balance is huge. What you said about the deep work, going outside, going for a walk, Beethoven, man, the author of the book Deep Work, Cal Newport, he's a mathematician, and he's a computer science professor. And what he would do is, and this fascinates me that he can do this in his head, but he would have a programming problem that he could not solve at his computer. So he would take the programming problem and he would go for a working walk. And what he would do is he would walk around the campus where he was the professor, and he would solve the problem in his head. And that's amazing to me. And I think that goes perfectly in line with what you were saying about Beethoven. And he would come to so many great conclusions on those walks. So if you're a creative, and if you're someone who's on a computer all day, this is cliche advice, and I know I'm going to sound like your mother, but go outside, because there is an amazing thing that happens when you go outside and you walk around and the sun is shining on your skin and you breathe in the fresh air. You don't have to go for a run. You don't have to jog. Just do a 20-minute light walk around your office or your neighborhood or where you are. And I think you'll be amazed at how refreshed you feel. So that's one way that you can prevent creative burnout. What you said is really good. I'm not going to touch on it too much for the sake of time, but working on other tasks, right? So it's not good if you have this all or nothing approach, like, oh man, I'm so burnt out, so I'm throwing away music altogether. I'm just going to go watch TV or binge on Netflix or whatever, what have you. There are other tasks that need to be done that, like you said, it's like interval training. You work your biceps, then you get tired on your biceps, you go work your triceps, and then you get tired on your triceps, you go work your core, that sort of thing. There's other productive things that you can work on to drive the ball forward. Things like social media, getting your social media presence, optimized, that sort of thing. Responding to emails, that sort of thing. So I think that's a great idea. The deep work technique is fantastic. The other technique is the Pomodoro technique, and we can put like a link in the show notes to how you would go about starting that. But the Pomodoro technique is basically this technique where you work completely undistracted, no email, no phone, no conversation for 25 minutes. Take a 5-minute break, and then you do that 4 more times in 4 cycles, and then you take a longer break, like a 15 or 30-minute break. And so if the deep work thing is just not feasible for you for whatever reason, now I would recommend the deep work, because if you do at least 1 deep work session a day, you're going to be blown away by how much your craft is going to improve, and you will drive. There's no substitute for a solid 3-hour chunk of deep work. But if you can't, for whatever reason, you're in a job or an environment that won't let you do that, the Pomodoro technique is great. And I just have 2 more recommendations. I know we're going over time, but I'll be very quick. Okay, so the second thing that I highly recommend, this is like the 6th thing, sorry, is you can tell I've thought about this a lot. Is to journal, to identify triggers in your life. Okay, so I know we all have mixed feelings about journaling, and I don't mean like Dear diary, today Sally said hi to me, like that sort of thing. It's more like a professional journal. So like what you would do is I use this app on Mac called Day One, and it tracks all of my journal entries. It tracks, you can tag certain things, like you can hashtag things, and so it'll group all of them together. And so what I'll do, and this is kind of just a peek into my own practices, if I'm having a crappy day, I will literally hashtag the word terrible. Okay. And then I will write what made the day terrible. Okay. If I'm having a good day, I will hashtag the day good, and I will write what made the day good. So then what I can do is I can look back and I can say, okay, let me look at all the good days I've had and all the failure days and all the crappy days I've had. What was consistent? What was the thread? And a lot of times it'll be like, well, I didn't get enough sleep. I didn't get enough sleep on the crappy days. So what does that tell me? That tells me I need to get more sleep. So that's what I mean when I say journal, to identify the triggers to your creative burnout. So if you're burning out creatively, journal about it, figure out what's going on inside of you, and also figure out, like, how did I get here? What made me get to this point? And I think a lot of it will be illuminating to you. The last thing is read biographies of people or books about new ideas. Okay, so this fills me up so much. And I know, Steven, you're a huge fan of reading, and I cannot overstate the importance of this for creative people. Something happens to your brain when you read a book. Something happens that doesn't happen with a podcast or a video or anything else, is when you start reading biographies of creative people. It doesn't need to be composers, just anyone who's creative. You start to feel so inspired. You see their journey, you see what they had to go through to get to the point that they're at now. And reading books about new ideas. Pick up a new theory book. Pick up some abstract theory book that talks about, this really weird, negative harmony. Exactly. The super hyper mega meta Lydian scale, or whatever. Which reminds me, talking about feeling inspired, I've been following Jacob Collier a lot lately. And he's a genius. I mean, I'm convinced he's from another planet. But that he's been inspiring me and filling me up, because he's a creative person. I'm watching him work, and it really helps me. It fills me up. It makes me want to make things, like him. So anyway, so that was a long-winded answer, but I've thought a lot about it. So I hope that there's some value in that people can take away.
Yeah, and I want to piggyback real quick. We got the time. Let's do it.
Awesome.
And if you don't have time, you can always hit pause and come back to it on your next drive. Isn't that right?
That's right. Or you can do the 2x thing on a podcast.
That's true.
I do that all the time.
Hey, 1.25. Woo. That's like the perfect speed. Anyway.
What's that? 1.25?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's like a slightly faster. Anyway, right. I was just going to piggyback on the whole journaling thing. Man, that's so big. And I have noticed in my life that I've done that. I've actually gone through that process of kind of journaled down, okay, what are my best days? When do I see the most productivity, the most creativity? Sure. And it's actually, there is a trend for me. It's when I get up early, get good sleep. It's when I exercise. It's when I have time to kind of plan out my day and to be thoughtful and spend time with my family and all these things that have nothing to do with music. It's pretty wild.
That's awesome, dude. That's awesome.
But I found there's like this small list of things that if I can incorporate these into my day, it's a good day. And I get to write music. So what it does is it charges me up and it fills me up and gives great value to what I do. And when I'm feeling pumped up and charged and positive, of course my music's going to be great because everything else in my life is taken care of. It's when you shirk off everything else in your life and you put yourself in a dungeon and you lock yourself away and the whole world's burning, but you're getting your music done. It becomes a chore. It becomes a chore and you're not inspired at all.
Right.
And your motivation for doing it, your inspiration is completely pulled away.
And you can't compose with a clean conscience.
No, you can't.
You can't because everything else in your life is in shambles.
And
so
you
it
don't
definitely affects the way you compose.
And you don't want to compose quickly, which sounds interesting, right? Because you think, oh, if I can just pull myself away for an hour, if I can just pull myself away for 2 hours, 3 hours, and write this thing, it'll be done, it'll be great. But it usually isn't. It's when you actually give yourself more time, give yourself a big cushion of time, that when you focus, you can get things done quickly. And it's a giant paradox, honestly, but it
is.
But that's kind of creativity. And one more thing I'll talk about is this idea of capturing the muse in the bottle, right? Capturing the lightning.
Yes.
I think consistency ultimately is what we need in our lives. And I'll go ahead and move on to question 3, because this is kind of an answer for that. And question 3 again was, what advice do we have for any composer who is experiencing creative burnout right now? I would say stop, breathe, go do other things, find ways to release stress, do something you enjoy, spend time with people, do something physically active. It could be exercise, it could be a sport. Go get inspired by the artists who made you want to become a composer in the first place. Go listen to your favorite soundtracks. But ultimately, that's good for like day one. That's good for getting out of that funk. But ultimately, you got to find a rhythm. You got to start writing something every day. And this is something that I'm trying to get myself back into, because years ago, before life was a little bit more complex, now I have a family and everything, and multiple jobs and all kinds of things going on in my life. You'd think I'd have every excuse in the world not to write music, but which is funny because that's what I do. But there's such a fulfillment, and there is a relaxation that comes when you're already generating material every day. If we believe that creativity is like a muscle, then we got to use it every day.
Sure.
Even if it's in the smallest way. And I'm not saying you have to go up to your studio and you have to pull open a blank Logic session and actually start writing music and recording music. That's not all composition is. There's actually there's a spectrum of things you can do. But maybe you just go to the piano and play for a few minutes every morning. Or maybe on the days you're not near a piano, you're not near a guitar or an instrument you like, bring some notation paper with you, some sheet music, and actually just scribble some things. Or maybe you're just kind of whistling as you walk, as you're taking a run, whatever. There's so many ways that you can start to write music. But I know for me, if that is one of the components for a great day, then even on a not work day, because I don't work every day, I think even on the non-work days, I got to use that creativity. Otherwise, it gets bent up and it becomes something that that works against me. And that, because if you're not using your muscle every day, then what's going to happen is on workout days, you're going to go in and you're going to be sore.
Right.
And
you're going to injure yourself, to
exactly.
continue with the metaphor.
Exactly, because you're going to have a big project that is eventually going to come up, and then you're going to just overstrain it. Instead, sure. If you're taking care of yourself and being healthy and having that balance, you're going to be able to get to that deep work so much sooner. Your warm-up time doesn't take as long. Anyone who works out, if you worked out once last week and now you're going in, it's going to be a lot harder to get back into the groove than if you had just gone yesterday. Sure. It's going to give you, it's going to take 5 minutes of kind of warming up. Okay, cool. My body knows what to do, versus the hour it might take to warm up. So it's the same as if you're going to write music. If you're going to try to turn this into a craft and make it your job, then you got to practice. You have to make it part of your rhythm and balance. So that's my best suggestion for someone who's in it right now. Make this a rhythm for yourself.
Absolutely. I think that's huge. The idea of that life is a marathon, not a sprint. And composition and our craft is a marathon, not a sprint. And so I think there's a lot of analogies in this podcast episode, mostly from you, which I think are very astute, and it's that of physical exercise. And there is a lot of similarities between creativity and physical exercise, especially in the sense that when you run a marathon, you pace yourself. You don't sprint. And I think that's a lot of what kind of we're getting at. This whole craft thing is not you're not going to find success when you're basically staying up for 24 hours, not eating, sleeping, or drinking, neglecting your family to try to get a cue out the door. Now, if you have a deadline, that's one thing, right? And you gotta obviously fulfill your deadlines. But I think having a rhythm, like you said, is just so important. Before I get to my question, I want to ask you a question, totally unscheduled. This is candid camera here. What was the biggest, most debilitating source of creative burnout for you personally in your career? And how did you overcome that? I think that might be something that our audience would find very valuable. And I'm curious as well.
Honestly, it's probably the transition from being single into marriage. And it's in no way to my wife's detriment, but rather it was this idea of I had this one way of doing life where I was writing music 7 days a week, and I was working very, very long hours. I was working overnight. And then all of a sudden, introduced living with someone else. And all of a sudden, I had to let my schedule had to meld with hers. And so I just remember distinctly this idea of having to figure out, okay, how am I supposed to record music if we're in the same room? How are we supposed to do all these kind of things? And so I remember I had to retrain myself and get really disciplined on how and when I wrote music. And I had to all of a sudden learn, okay, it is possible to write music in 3-hour chunks or in 2-hour chunks, whatever. I don't have to sit here for 10 hours and hope that lightning strikes me.
Right.
And so I just remember in that process, there was a lot of burnout because it was kind of trial and error, to be honest. And I think it's okay to an extent, but I think that there was this time of when there's tension outside of your writing space, and anyone who's been married, you know that first, there's just a lot of arguments that happen in that first 6 months or so.
Sure.
That you come through and you become a better team through that. But I think in any relationship, honestly, there's a certain gel period where you're learning each other,
right,
and your limits and your boundaries. And I think that when there's tension outside of your creative space, it shows.
It does.
And it gets really hard to get back into that creative zone. But I think as there's the theme of today, this whole idea of balance and health, when there's health in all the areas of your life, man, when you can sit down and start writing music as almost a release, a creative release, to acknowledge the health in the rest of your life, I think your music starts to feel that way, and people notice that. And I think the most impactful music I've ever written have been in periods and times of me being within great joy.
Yeah.
It comes through our music because
it does.
My saddest music, my most heartbreaking music is when I was in the most heartbreak, because I think music is a conduit of emotion that it can hold whatever we fill it up with and how we're feeling in that moment. Doesn't mean our music has to always be happy, whatever, but I think pulling from those experiences is huge. And so for me, that automatically comes to mind because that was a big transition process for me. And ultimately, I'm for the better because now I'm disciplined and now I can sit down. Even if I do only have an hour to write music, I can do it. And those are the hardest moments because in those moments, I know if I had 3 hours, I could actually finish what I started. But this is where utilizing tools is really important. Using things like Voice Memo and Evernote and these things we've talked about, you can at least start the idea. And if I know I only have an hour, what I'll do, and it's a 3-hour project, what I start to do is instead of just starting, I will actually try to give an outline as accurately as possible. And I will actually try to, on the piano, I'll like write the melody of the A section, write the melody of the B section, of the C section. I'll get all the things I know that if I don't write down now, I will forget them and that inspiration will be lost. And so I will get that core because you can always come back when you're not feeling inspired and fill out the details, because that's
Sure.
where the training, that's where the academia comes in. That's where the voice leading and the orchestration and the things
Right.
that don't require any actual creativity has
Right.
everything to do with just filling in. It's like coloring or something.
It's like paint by numbers. Yeah. You have the outline ready, and then you come back later and fill it in.
So that's my suggestion for anyone who needs, when you're in that creative zone, when you're in that deep work moment, prepare for the times that you're not, so that you're never wasting time. You're always using it.
That's great, man. And thank you so much for sharing about your transition. I think that's really helpful and vulnerable to share. I think balance is important, but when you become married, it's really important. Like you can get away with being imbalanced when you're single. You just can. I mean, because when you burn out, you don't affect anybody but yourself. But one thing that my wife's taught me is that she's like, listen, man, when your life is out of balance and you burn out, you affect me and now my son, who's 10 months old, and that adds a whole new layer of needing balance. But yeah, I think that's really, really great advice. Thanks for sharing, man. I'll share just a few things to answer your question. What advice I have for a composer who's experiencing creative burnout. The first thing is going to be to reconnect with your why. I've heard it said kind of cheesy, but you lose your way when you lose your why. And basically that just means when you forget why you do this in the first place is when you start to get lost in the weeds and when creative burnout becomes a very real reality. So I think it's always good in businesses. They always have a mission statement. Why do we do this? Why do we do what we do? I think every composer and every creative for that matter, and really pretty much every person, but especially a creative, should have a written mission statement of why you do this. Why do you create? Why do you make music? Is it just because you want to sort of like bless other people, encourage other people, make other people feel good? Do you make music just for yourself? Is it something that you do as just a sense of personal fulfillment? Is it something like a creative outlet? A big why for me is I want to look back on my life and I want to have a large body of work. That to me would be just so satisfying to look back on my life. And not that I made a ton of money or whatever, but just like I wrote all of these songs, and just to have that body of work, I think is powerful. So whatever your why is as a composer, reconnect with that, maybe even write it down somewhere and put it somewhere in your office, in your room, on your bathroom mirror, somewhere where you can see it every day and just remember why you do this. The second thing is, reach out to a fellow composer or creative. If you're experiencing creative burnout, reach out to a friend. Reach out to someone, start getting involved in Facebook groups. There's so many nice people out there that are composers in film and games and media that are so helpful and so kind. And when you start making friends, like you and I, Steven, we met over the internet and now we're friends and we're doing a podcast together. I think when you make these friends, there's nothing better than just processing this burnout with a friend, and just reaching out to another creative, another composer and saying, man, I am just feeling totally burnt out. I need some encouragement. I need some help. I find that even if those people don't offer you like advice, if they just listen to you and just say, man, I've been there. I totally get what you're going through right now. You feel so filled up and encouraged after that. So that's a big thing for me. The next thing would be to take a break from creating art and enter a season of consuming art. Now, for some people whose career this is, that may not be the easiest thing. You may have to kind of power through this season because it might be something that you need to do for a job. But if you have a break and you don't have any deadlines, take a day, 2 days, and just say, listen, I'm not going to write today. I am just going to listen to music and consume art. I'm going to refill my creative tank. Just like a writer can't write well unless they read a lot. I think it's hard for composers to compose well unless we listen to a lot of music. And then the two more things that I have is if you learn a new chord, a technique, or honestly just try a new piece of software. So this is very practical advice, but sometimes when I download a new plugin, or I need to learn a new chord, or I learn something new like negative harmony, or like, something like that, I get really inspired and I'm like, I want to try this. I want to put this in a composition. And so I start working on it, and it starts off very technical, like, oh, let me just see how I can implement, the augmented Lydian scale into some sort of progression, and then it becomes a song. And so I think that can be very helpful. And then the last thing that I have to say is this is sort of the last ditch effort of when you really just, you have to get a job done, but you're feeling creatively burnt out. The brute force approach. You set a timer for 5 minutes and you tell yourself, I'm just going to work on it for 5 minutes. I guarantee you 90% of the time you'll get into a creative flow and you'll go beyond that 5 minutes. But when you're feeling so burnt out that you're just like, man, I feel like I can't even do a lick of work right now, set a timer for 5 minutes and just tell yourself 5 minutes, no problem. Just do 5 minutes, composition, mixing, arrangement, whatever. I almost guarantee you when that timer goes up, you're going to want to keep going. It's just that initial starting that's the hardest thing. So those are a few recommendations that I would give to people in creative burnout.
That's fantastic. And a few shout outs, as you mentioned, some of those resources. I just want to give some practical resources. The first would be the book Start With Why, and that is by Simon Sinek. And we'll put links to all these things in the show notes. But Start With Why, that's my personal best recommendation to find your why. I think he does a fantastic job. That's a really great book. And you can help figure that out in the right order. And as far as community goes, we have the Sonic Storytellers Facebook group. So come join, come ask your questions. And we're going to really start ramping that up in 2018, doing a lot more with the group there. So come join. That's a free private group. And then if you do want to learn some of that more advanced music theory, Rick Beato, that's Rick, Beato. He is an Atlanta-based teacher, and he has a pretty incredible story. He's been a famous music producer for a long time, and he teaches some of the most advanced music theory techniques I've ever heard of. And he has a lot of great resources there, and he is a YouTuber. And he has really done some incredible things. So we'll link to his work as well. And I think any of those things can help spark that creativity and that passion to take it to the next level and ultimately to get out of creative burnout and to prevent it moving forward by establishing healthy rhythms in your life. So Matt, I think it's time for us to wrap this thing up, but thank you so much everyone for listening. Hope this has been enjoyable for you. And again, we'll have those links in the show notes for you. And I'm excited for 2018. It sounds like we got a great lineup, a lot of great topics we're going to be diving into this year. So stick around, subscribe to the podcast for more like this, and find both of us on YouTube. Matt also has his own channel. He's done some really fascinating things recently with Super Mario World music, actually, which has been very fascinating to watch. So check out his channel there, and also, again, mattkenyon.net. He has some pretty awesome interviews with composers coming up this year as well. So we'll keep an eye out for that and give more shout-outs as those come up. So thanks again, Matt. Appreciate you, and I know we'll be chatting more from here on some other topics coming up. I'm excited.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Steven, and thank you for listening, everyone out there.
All right, man. Well, you have a good one. See you guys.
You too. See you, bud.